We spent our summers walking in the fields of the dead. As soon as the warm weather came, my grandmother gathered my sister and I for the early walk to the graveyard. It was on the back road, boxed in by trees, a trailer park, and the imposing waste stumps of the old Hollinger mine. Just a few acres of memory carved from a jack pine forest. But even among the dead, the vitality of a northern summer imposed itself. Birds cacawed, and the stillness of the landscape was broken by the background static of grasshoppers or the eerie creaking of trinkets hanging from homemade shrines. On hot days, the air was sweet with the smell of freshly cut grass. And summer brought, if not life, then individuality back to the graveyard. By mid-May, the faces had all emerged from the blanket of snow to bask in the warmth of a northern summer. Those faces never changed. They peered from the gravestone ovals, young, proud, immigrants to Canada. Few people ever visited the fields of the dead. It was a domain of old women, aged mining widows picking among the graves like displaced crows. My grandmother was one of those crows. Her husband, Charlie Angus, died in the machine shop of the Hollinger mine in April 1962, and I was born 7 months later. But visiting Charlie's grave was only part of the reason we were there. My grandmother's world was passing away, and she knew it. She spent her increasingly short days filling out the long, drawn-out summer of the young ones. And over tea and scones, she conjured up the ghosts of the Somme, Culloden, and Bannockburn. And through our trips to the graveyard, she introduced us to the friends in the ovals. They became our friends waiting on the other side. I spent countless hours running among the rows, and over time I learned the layout of the neighborhoods. Syrian here, Yugoslavian there, Protestant on this side, Chinese over yonder. It was a parallel town site of memory and mourning. There's Matty Bukovic, gassed in the Conneaura mine. He's a neighbor to Big John Bunziak, crushed by a locomotive falling into the Hollinger shaft. Here lies 13-year-old Julia Chichi, peering out through the glass like a frightened prisoner of time. Over near the garage bay where the groundkeepers sit for their morning smoke and coffee lies beautiful Annie Kostelik, betrothed to a man who immigrated to the Porcupine 2 years before she was born. Annie made the trip from Croatia to Canada when she was 24 years old. And barely had she arrived in her new home of Schumacher when she was brought down by typhoid fever. Her husband Milan Bogdanovic died 4 years later at the ripe old age of 48. In the early 20th century, Canada relied on its immigrant population as industrial serfs for the mining and lumbering camps of the northern frontier. These families put down roots in communities that were completely isolated from the larger Anglo-Saxon cultural milieu of what was then Canadian society. In the Porcupine, a surprisingly varied and textured culture developed in what was otherwise a land of bleak and limited opportunities. By the early 1930s, there were over 51 nationalities living in the region. The Porcupine was an early example of the multicultural society that urban Canada would later claim to have invented. And yet the rich cultural fabric of the Porcupine has been largely overlooked in studies of Canadian history. The culture of multi-ethnic hard rock mining camps has never seemed to fit into the comfortable cliches by which Canada tells its story. Oh, the petticoats on Prince Edward Island, the fiddled plain lumberjacks, the stoic prairie farm women in print dresses, the Klondike music halls with roller pianos. All too often in Canada, the potentially powerful pedagogy of place has been diffused by an amalgam of kitschy Canadiana folklore. To get to the real story of Canadian history, we need to look below the cliches and ask ourselves why some stories are told and others are forgotten or glossed over. Because over the span of 1 or 2 lifetimes, the dark or more complex clouds of an immigrant and class-divided frontier has been airbrushed from Canadian memory. In many ways, the cemetery has become the only repository of the gritty realities of the immigrant life in the Porcupine. Now, admittedly, it's only a partial record, the recording of sorrow and loss rather than the markers and milestones of joy, hope, and accomplishments. But the faces and the dates tell their own compelling stories. Row after row of men cut down in their 30s and 40s from accidents and silicosis. Young mothers dead in childbirth, a field of little children. I used to believe that if I stood in the right place long enough, or learned to watch with careful eyes, I would find that mysterious passageway which separated me from the faces on the other side of the oval. Perhaps there's a part of me that still believes it, because my search for answers has brought me back again and again and again to stare into these mirrors of stone. The faces in the ovals taught me my first lessons in history. They continue to teach me lessons in life. I see their faces like indelible watermarks on the landscape of my life. I want them to know that after all these years, the little boy still comes back, and he never did forget.